Welcome to 321 Crash Course. Today's episode is the Big 4 upgrade and the Big Alternator upgrade. So what exactly is the Big 4 upgrade? We're going to find out starting now.
The Big 4 upgrade is replacing small factory wires with a larger gauge wires. We will be using a 100% copper, finely stranded, 1/0 American gauge wire for this project. Before we start, we will be replacing the old alternator with a new high power output alternator. This alternator puts out over 240 amps of power. This beast will meet any power demand. In a nutshell, here is what the big upgrade is all about. Here is an alternator and a battery. There is a connection between an alternator and a battery. From the negative post of the battery, another wire is connected to the engine block, and then to the chassis. And the last connection is to the body of the truck. After upgrading to a bigger alternator, a new connection will be added directly to the alternator, from the negative post. The positive wire will be replaced with a thicker wire, with a 300 amp fuse added. The wire to the chassis will be replaced, with a thicker wire. The wire to the body will be replaced as well. The wire to the engine block will remain as is. It will act as a supplement. And that's what the Big 4 upgrade is all about. This project is being performed on a 2004 Ford F-150. First thing to do is to disconnect the battery. Starting with the negative post, and then the positive post. It's a great idea to place a piece of cardboard over the battery to avoid accidental contact. I can assure you, you don't want any unexpected surprises. Due to the fact that the alternator is under the air intake assembly, we will need to remove it. Start by removing the screws. More likely a 10mm socket. Put the screws in a safe place, before they grow legs and run. Next, carefully disconnect the electrical connector. And then carefully unplug the crankcase breather hose. Now, remove the air intake assembly. It may take a little wiggle to come out. Just be patient. Finally, here is the old alternator. Grab a special serpentine belt tool, or a big breaker bar, and remove the belt from the alternator. You don't have to remove the whole belt. If you do, make sure you have a diagram for the belt arrangement. Next, remove the mounting bolts on top. Remove the retaining clip. Remove the nut from the power pole of the alternator. Loosen the bolts at the bottom of the alternator. Just enough to pull the alternator up. Using a simple screwdriver, just press the clip to unplug the connector. You can clearly see what a big difference there is between the two. Now, separate the alternator wiring harness. Be careful when splitting the wire loom. In this harness, there is a power wire, sensor wire, and the control wire from the powertrain control module. The power and the sensor wires have fusible links wired in. However, you may opt out separating the harness if you are not comfortable doing this part. Just skip this step. It can be reconnected as it was. It will simply act as a supplement. In this project, the power wire will be discarded. Carefully place the new alternator in place of the old one. Put the bracket back exactly as it was. Insert the screws in by hand. Then tighten it down. Tighten on the alternator side first. Then, tighten the last 2 bolts, making sure the alternator is lined up with the other pulleys. Finally, torque all the bolts down to factory specification. You may add a ground wire to the bolt and then tighten the bottom bolts to factory specification. You may experiment with landing the ground wire in different parts of the alternator. As long as it is landed at the alternator. You might need to scrape the coating off the alternator for the best ground. Here is how to make your own wire set. Here's a wire and a lug. Make sure the lug is the right fit for the post being mounted on. Put a mark on the wire that matches the lug. Use a special stripping tool, or you may use a utility knife to cut the outer jacket of the wire. Carefully insert the lug at the end of the wire. With a special crimping tool, crimp the lug down tight. Slip on a special heat shrink tubing. This shrink tubing has an adhesive to create an airtight seal. Take your time heating the shrink tubing with a heat gun or a lighter. If you use a lighter, remember that the shrink tubing gets very hot. Be careful. Next, slip on a boot. It may take a little wiggle to get it in. This wire is now ready for the alternator. You may now land the wire on the alternator lug. You may tighten it up to no more than 10 foot-pounds. Restore the belt back on the alternator pulley. And plug the harness connector back onto the alternator. And now the fun part. Adding the split loom to the wires. This helps to protect the wires and make it look professional. Purchase a pack of electrical tape. And take your time wrapping the wires. This step is optional. I will say, it sure does give it a factory look. Since this truck runs many accessories, we are installing a 6-lug battery terminal. First we will stage them for best results. This connector leads to the OEM harness. This terminal leads to the aftermarket fuse block for accessories and off-road lights. This terminal with a cubed fuse leads to a second battery, which is isolated by a solenoid. This terminal goes to the winch. This is the terminal stud fuse block. These are great to use because you can mount them directly to the battery stud. This one will be used for the alternator. And now we are landing all the ground wires. We will crimp the terminals as we go. This ground point is the chassis. Remove the old terminal. It is a good idea to buff the area before landing the new terminal. We will be mounting the new terminal with the old one. The old terminal is coming from the engine block at the starter. It will act as a supplement. Make sure to hand start the bolt before using any tools. Heat shrinking the terminals gives it a clean look and protects the terminal connection. This is the main ground point to the body of the truck. This spot is a little tricky to get to. Add a little piece of tape to keep the tool from flopping down. This piece will be connected between the battery and the body of the truck. It is very important to hand start the bolt, especially in tight spots. And finally, land all of your ground wires. Tighten down all the bolts. This is an 18 gauge fusible link with a 16 gauge wire that will be mounted to the battery. This is an old one from the truck. Fusible links can be found online or at an auto parts store. As shown here, it is connected to the alternator. This measures volts on the battery. The round end lands on the battery terminal. A fusible link casing will be reused to house the new link. We'll just use a simple heat shrink tubing to seal it. Now it's time to secure the wires. We are using insulated cable clamps and a spring nut. Of course, we must use the popular 10 milliliter bolt with whatever threading. Fasten the insulated cable clamp. Don't forget to connect the alternator plug. This goes to the PCM. Now it's time to put everything back. And finally, connect the terminals to the battery. Starting with the positive post.
All right, the moment of truth. Well, looks like everything works. We're good to go.
Bring out your multimeter. We are going to measure voltage. Tap one to the negative post and one to the positive post. You should have at least 13.5 to 14.5 volts on the meter. Now we must do a resistance earth test. Tap the probe to the alternator housing and one to the negative battery post. There should be no more than 0.1 volts difference. Do the same for the positive side of the alternator as well. If the voltage exceeds, chances are it may be a poor connection. Check your connection and measure it again. This concludes our project.
I really hope you enjoyed this video, so please like, subscribe, and ring that bell, and I promise I will come out with some more video projects.